Look, let me try to make some sense of what's going on in Victoria with the pandemic, the lockdown, the politics and the media. Much of it is hysterical and is irrational, as you know. Let's start with what we all agree on. That is that the coronavirus is dangerous. We need to keep on top of it. And it's the elderly, especially those who are in aged care, who are most at risk. The rest of the community, the young and the healthy, really have little to fear. Now, the question for Victoria first is why on earth the whole state is in lockdown. There are still fewer than 50 cases, and most of those are people already isolated and tested as close contacts of other cases. So the lockdown so far has done very little except ruin schooling, disrupt businesses, hit casual workers, ruin funerals, wreck weddings, hurt the economy and all the rest of it. We know from epidemiologists examining the data that the last Melbourne lockdown did nothing. It was absolutely pointless. We still don't know whether this lockdown has achieved anything. Here's the acting Premier today when he was asked about that very point.
As Professor Sutton outlined, the ultimate goal of a circuit breaker lockdown is for our public health team to get ahead of the outbreak and for the cases to come down. And as Professor Sutton outlined before he had to leave, is that we are running neck and neck with this thing right now, neck and neck with it. So the next couple of days are going to be so critical. And I just want to say to people that it may get worse before it gets better.
So James Merlino was asked a number of times what his lockdown had achieved, and he couldn't really tell us. And he was also completely vague about what the lockdown was actually aiming to achieve. That is, how anyone would know it had worked or when it was time to end it. The whole thing remains open-ended and ominous.
We've got a lot of high-risk sites that we are concerned about. The next few days will be absolutely critical. So, we'll have a better sense, as Professor Sutton has said, through the course of this circuit breaker lockdown, and we'll be able to provide advice based on public health advice. But right now, it would be unfair on any individual to speculate on what might happen.
Now, the other thing the acting Premier did was blame everyone else, from other states to Canberra and, of course, the hotel quarantine system and the vaccination program.
Let's remember that this outbreak that we are dealing with right now originated from a hotel quarantine breach in South Australia. That's a fact. That all the genomic testing points to the outbreak in hotel quarantine in South Australia. Now, I've said we would not be in this position. We would be in a very different world if we had had a successful rollout of the Commonwealth's vaccination program. It would be a very different world if we had, alongside hotel quarantine, alternative quarantine arrangements for our highest risk cohorts that travel in from overseas. But we don't have that.
Just incredible, isn't it? The state where most of the deaths occurred last year, the state that had the worst hotel quarantine system, the worst contact tracing, the worst and slowest QR code system, the state that's had the most lockdowns, the longest and strictest lockdowns. This state apparently is not to blame. The Victorian government says its problems are the hotel quarantine system and the fact that there was a letdown in South Australia. This is the hotel quarantine system that applies in every other state, and the vaccination rollout that is happening in every other state too. It's just pathetic. And the politicians and media who encourage this sort of buck passing are clearly more interested in partisan politicking than public health. We ought to be pleased that most of the aged have been vaccinated. Some people don't want the jab. That's their choice and their risk. But we need to remember vaccination does not prevent infection. It helps people survive. We ought to be pleased we're only getting a handful of new cases each day in Melbourne. Some of these infected people have already been vaccinated. Still, infections in aged care centres, of course, are a worry. We will be managing this stuff for months and years to come. So the real question remains, why is Victoria in lockdown? And what next? This pretense that we can eliminate the virus is so damaging. The whole point of vaccination is so we can live with the virus. And that's what we need to learn to do.